How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Today on Culture Architects, we have a very special guest. We have Yael Averbuch West with us, and Yael has a pretty amazing and extensive background. So Yael is a soccer pro in every sense of the word. So Yael played as a child. She ended up going to the University of North Carolina. Some of our listeners may remember the interview that I did with the North Carolina coach Anson Dorrance, where they won many, many championships. And during Yael's time there, she was captain of the team. They won 2 national championships when she was there. Her number was retired. She was also National Player of the Year when she was there. She went on to play on the U.S. national team. She played professionally all over the world. She played in the Women's Professional Soccer League. She also has created, she's the CEO and the founder of a training app company for soccer called Techne Futbol. And in addition to all of that, actually, she also was the first president, the founder, and the first head of the Women's Players Association for the Women's Professional Soccer League. And on top of all of that, Yael happens to be the general manager for Gotham FC, the New York, New Jersey team in the Women's Professional League. So if there's anybody that knows anything about soccer and athletics, it's Yael. So Yael, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the podcast.
I'm excited. I feel a little tired listening to what you just shared about my life. Thank you.
You've done a lot, that's for sure. So we, of course, on this podcast talk a lot about culture. And so you have been on so many different teams at so many points in your life. And I'm sure you've seen teams that had fantastic cultures and you've seen teams that had lousy cultures. And I'm curious, so let's just start with what was the team that you were on that had the worst culture that you can think of?
The worst culture.
Yep.
I thought you were going to ask the opposite.
Next I'm going to ask you the opposite. But let's start with the worst. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I would say that I was part of some youth national teams in the lead up to, all of us aspiring to be on the full women's U.S. national team. And some of those teams were competitive in all the wrong ways and was a really unpleasant and isolating and kind of scary place to show up. And we would go to these training camps. So it wasn't a team that, part of the reason the culture probably was difficult was it wasn't a team where you were together day in and day out throughout the year. It was kind of, you'd go to a training camp and a lot of the same people would be at the training camps, but definitely, I have a kind of a dread in my kind of heart when I think of being part of some of those camps. It was pretty unpleasant at times.
And so let's go the opposite end. So all these teams you've been on, you won lots of championships. What was the best culture team you ever wrote on?
Yeah, the University of North Carolina is the easy answer, and for a good reason, I think. And I've thought about this a lot because now in my role where I'm responsible for a young program and creating a culture, I've thought a lot about how much time builds culture. And what I stepped into at UNC in the women's soccer program was such a long-standing culture that had layers and layers built largely on the leadership of Anson Dorrance. But what I have learned a great deal and seen with cultures is not just the leader saying the culture. Like we didn't start off our season there with a presentation from Anson on what is the culture. It was layered into every single thing we did and how we showed up and how we spoke to each other and the expectations and the way we viewed them. And so many, it was just so ingrained in every essence of what mattered and what didn't. I think too, what didn't matter, And so I think about that a lot and how wonderful it was and how we were set up to win and repeat that winning again and again. And that's really, really hard to build. I realize that now, but definitely that culture stands out to me. And there's a good reason that it's in all the books as an outstanding women's soccer culture.
So when you think about how Anson did that and what you've learned about that, I think about when you came in as a high school graduate, and there you are, your first year, your freshman, and you're going to somehow get integrated into this culture. We talk about, in the business setting, we talk about integration. How do you hire people in a company and they come in and somehow they have to figure out what this culture is. So how did Anson do that at North Carolina?
I've thought about this so much and I've tried to think back because it's so interesting you say that, at Gotham, that's exactly what we're trying to create that we don't yet have. we are so new that we don't have, the Gotham way, quote unquote, and where, people come and we say, this is what it means to be here. Here's how you act. Here's how you do things. We are literally creating that as we operate. And I have thought many times back on, how did I know? When I showed up at UNC, how did I know how to act or what was important? And I think part of it was that the other players in the program clearly understood and embodied that. So there were very strong leaders from within the team and the seniors at the time, the juniors at the time, who through their actions, you just knew, like if you were a little too slow on the ball, you're going to get slide tackled. If you were not doing what you're supposed to, a teammate's going to hold you accountable. And what I think was really good in the way that I learned the culture at UNC was not really top down. It wasn't Anson coming in and saying, here, okay, young ladies, here's how you need to do things. It was what I've since learned. I like this term, a self-cleaning culture. Like we as a team held each other accountable to the way we wanted it to be. And it was really important because there was such a long history of success. We didn't want to be the ones to screw it up. Yes. So because of that, there was a huge onus on the team and the leadership within the player group. If we were not a good team or we didn't have a good culture, it wasn't because of Anson Dorrance and the University of North Carolina. It was because of us. Yeah. So there was a lot of onus on the players to create that culture every day, to hold one another accountable. And that's really special. And it's really, really hard to build.
I think about as I hear you say that, I'm thinking of two examples that come to my mind. One is, you probably remember I've talked about the Moorestown women's lacrosse team. I've written about them, and they've gone, 20 years where they're always one of the best teams in the country. And I interviewed they've had a couple of coaches there over that 20-year period. Often the coach, and you've probably seen this in youth programs too, the coach is often a former player. So they lived in that. But I interviewed the coaches, a husband and wife who've been coaching for a lot of years, and similar comments about the players that come in learn from the juniors and seniors who then go on and graduate. And there's a standard to be upheld, and people come in and you don't want to be the one letting it down. But there's a lot of the ownership of it came from the junior and senior players showing the younger players, this is how we do it here. And I think about that even in professional sports. I think about, I'm a big Eagles fan, and our audience may or may not know I'm a season ticket holder for the Eagles, and so I'm at every game. And as Yael and I do this interview, is the day after an Eagles playoff win, so that was a good thing. But anyway, when you read the articles about the Eagles, they talk a lot about their culture there. And I read articles about the veteran players bringing in the younger ones and showing them this is what it looks like to be a professional. They're coming out of college. They don't really know what it is to be a professional. And these people these senior leaders of the team in a professional setting are showing the others, this is how we do it, and going out of their way to help younger players. I can imagine there could be some teams where veterans look at the young players as upstarts. What are these people, these young people, what do they know? Instead of in a different team, like I look at how the Eagles are, and those players are bringing them under their wing, and they're teaching them, and they're showing them, and they're encouraging them, and showing them this is how we do it on the Eagles. And I was reading an article recently about that as well, and their coach, Nick Sirianni, talks a lot about connection. And he makes an interesting point, and this may be relevant for Gotham FC too, but he said that in a college program, all the kids are basically in the same stage of life. On a professional sports team, you've got people, they live in different places. They don't all live in a dorm. They live in different places. Some are married, some aren't. Some have kids, some don't. They're very different from each other. And so it's that much more important to find ways to create connection. And what he says is that, and it makes sense to me, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that when people feel really connected, they work harder for each other. Your teammates, I want to go the extra mile for my teammate. And that translates into performance. And I'm sure you've seen that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a huge part of it. I was listening to a panel recently. We had some NWSL league meetings. They set up a really great panel, and I can't remember who said it, but someone said they were a renowned college coach, and they said that the freshmen are only as good as the seniors let them be. And I think that that is really true. Is that, and there was a lot of conversation about culture not, being top down. I think that, that is a way you can do it. That sometimes is the way it needs to start. But to your point, the culture is actually for good or for bad. It's what players see every day and they see their teammates doing. And that becomes the culture. And culture isn't always all the good things. The culture is also the things that you don't want in your environment, but it's the daily interactions and like what it means to be a blank player, blank employee of that place. So definitely we think about that a lot at Gotham, and that's a challenge too. When, when your team is changing a lot, in college, for me at least, there's a normal cycle. It was before all the transfer portal and all the things now with NIL, but your seniors usually had been there for 4 years, the juniors for 3 years, and there's kind of this formula. So that you have people who have done this at least for a few years. At Gotham, one of the challenges we had last year and even the year before is the team changes, its makeup changes often enough. And that's true at all in NWSL and probably in sports in general, depending on where you are, that there's enough change that when you don't happen to have that group that's been there for a while, that are also the older, more veteran players, it presents a challenge in terms of where is that leadership going to come from? And that's a conversation we have a lot, is where's our leadership going to come from? Is it the right balance, the right mix of players to have that leadership and that mentorship in a certain way, as to showing the young players, here's how it's done. Here's how you do it well. Here's what we expect of you. That's very strong, by the way, on the U.S. women's national team, the player-led culture, because the coach there changes a little too regularly sometimes, but the players pass along that culture.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thought about the degree to which this is top-down versus not. So if we go back to UNC, I mean, I hear what you're saying about, obviously, Anson could say whatever he wants, but the players are going to either live it or not, and then they're going to have to transfer it. But Anson certainly talked a lot about the core values that he had established. And so it sounds like, at least from his perspective, maybe you have a different, but that there were things that Anson set out to say, this is how we're going to do it at UNC. Now, again, the players have to live that. So where is the balance between the leader, whether it's the coach, owner, GM, whoever it is, saying this is what it's going to be, and the degree to which the players are developing that?
Yeah, it has to be, something has to be set by the leadership. The players don't just make it on their own. And I think that's always going to be a recipe for some kind of disaster if you just say, hey, hand it over, it's your responsibility. I feel like I'm stealing things from all the wonderful things I've heard over the years, but our head coach here at Gotham actually said something interesting in a conversation. And I think this is true. I think the leadership needs to build the road, and then the players or whoever's in the culture needs to drive the cars. And so I do think it is very important. And what Anson Dorrance essentially did was he set up a model where it was clear how you succeed. And how you succeed is by competing and being the best at what you do against your teammates. And that, in his methodology, is how then you succeed collectively against your opponent. And that the culture was initially built by the structure he set up of how you train, how you compete, how that gets recorded, how he selects his lineups, how he does his substitutions. So he set the framework for what makes you successful in his model, what helps you win. And from there, the nuances of what that looks like and what things, when you're really focused on winning and competing, you can't focus on all the things. So some things don't matter. For example, it did not matter to us that we were wearing matching training gear and looked incredibly unified in our appearance at training. What mattered was what you did and your performance and how hard you went against your teammate in the 1v1s. And so I think about that a lot of the things that didn't matter. Like at UNC, our locker room was not, people always say, oh, you go to UNC, it's probably the facilities are so nice. No, our locker room was not, it wasn't special. It actually wasn't nice at all. It was very gritty. It was kind of broken down. They have much nicer facilities now, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the core values, and that you were being evaluated based on how good of a teammate you were, how strong your leadership was, how much you responded to difficult situations with class and empathy and those kind of things. And so you can only focus on so many things. And I think quite often, the stronger the leadership's focus is on the areas that do matter, it kind of dictates to people also what doesn't matter. Right. And I think that's really important. You don't have energy to do all of the things ever. No one has that energy. So it is really important to prioritize what matters in your program, what matters in your company. And that's where I think the leader really sets the foundation and kind of gives everyone the guardrails. And from within that, the people operating day to day need to figure out the way they want to do it.
So when you think about, I know Anson talked about, and you referred to it, there was a set of core values that he had established. I remember him talking about some quotes he had around all of those and things like that.
Oh, yes, we had to memorize those.
So were there other teams you've been on where well, let me ask it this way. In most teams that you've been on, let's say at a higher level, U.S. national team, the professional teams that you've been on, do most of those teams have a set of core values or some statements of that type, or is that unusual in professional ranks?
No, I think it's pretty usual. I think the difference is, and what I've noticed is that I kind of have this pet peeve when people have these really standard kind of like BS things they just write up on the wall. And I even, I struggle when people are like, well, we need to say what our culture is. Like, I think there is some aspect of that, but actually what we need to do is like behave what our culture is, right, and be honest about what behaviors move us towards or away from those values. So I think, yes, I would say that UNC was probably the strongest of any organization I've been part of in terms of a really clear set of core values. It was kind of a joke that we had to memorize these quotes, but there was a lot of power in those quotes. And through memorizing them, we really did internalize some things that were very important to Anson in his leadership. And I've been other places where that's done to a lesser extent, or where there's some monogram drawn up or some list of values. But what I would say is what made them at UNC so powerful and so memorable were, one, that it was we had to memorize them, which I actually think now looking back, I like a lot more than when I was stressed by it at the time. I'm like, we're trying to win the game and have to memorize this thing. But what was really powerful too was that Anson really embodied them. And I think that was something that I greatly respected, because what happened at UNC is that I felt through my time there, I know a lot of other athletes felt this way in their time in the program, felt that there was great meaning behind what we were doing that was broader than just winning some soccer games or individual achievement. By being part of the program, you felt that you were doing something important in life. And that is a really difficult thing to create, to where people feel that there is significant value in what you're doing beyond trying to make the national team or your own individual goals, because those on any given day could be going sideways, the wrong way, whatever it is. But the values at UNC that were written were linked very clearly to how we behaved and what was expected. And I'd say, whereas it's not abnormal to have those things written out, the way in which they were implemented was much stronger there than a lot of other places I've been and seen them. And I can't, to be honest, I know they've been other places. I can't remember them from other places because they weren't.
Which suggests there wasn't that big.
Yeah, exactly. But I definitely know they were listed. We had the presentation in preseason where they were said, and then you never see them again. You don't talk about them again. They kind of go by the wayside. But Anson was able to implement them into a larger framework in a way that I think was really special.
I remember when I was talking to Anson, he talked about a lot that he learned from Dean Smith at UNC. And I also had interviewed Matt Doherty, who had coached at UNC and had played under Dean Smith. And Matt talks reverently about Dean Smith, as does Anson, and what he learned. And one of the things that Matt Doherty talked about playing on the basketball team under Dean Smith, and I want to ask you about these kinds of examples in your career, is we talk a lot at CultureWise about the importance of rituals, and that rituals help us to, in a systematic way, embed the things that are important. I mean, to some degree, the memorization of those things was a ritual. And Matt Doherty talked about that on the UNC basketball team. Dean Smith really wanted to promote teamwork and passing the ball. And there was this ritual that when someone made a good pass, you looked at them and you kind of pointed your finger and you nodded at them. And this was like a way, you're acknowledging the person who made the pass even more than the person who made the basket. And it was just, this is a ritual. It's just, this is what we do here. And I'm curious whether at UNC or other places, were there rituals like that, whether overtly or maybe less obviously, help to ingrain the culture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognize now kind of more than I maybe did at the time, which ones I really liked and thought were powerful. I think too, if you don't have the right foundation for them, those things also can become cheesy and go wrong.
Yes.
So it's really an art
question.
to get them right. When growing up playing soccer in North Jersey, there's people from all over the world who would play. Like sometimes I couldn't even communicate with the people coming to my practice sessions. They spoke other languages, but there was a strong culture and this comes from a cultural soccer thing, I think, but it I'm sure applies in other fields, is when certain people would show up, so we had a girls team, an under 18 girls team. So it was all high school ages girls. And we would have men and boys from all around the world come and play. A lot of them were Spanish speaking or come from other cultures. And when they show up, they would go around and shake every person's hand. They'd look them in the eyes and they would show respect. I'm showing up to do this with you. We're about to compete. We're about to train, but hi, how are you today? I'm a human being. You're a human being. We're about to embark on this together. And I really, really like that. And, our coach, we have a Spanish head coach now, and I don't think this is necessarily a Spanish thing or a Spanish speaking country thing, but he goes around and does a little fist bump with every player and every staff member in the morning. And I think, and it's still a big group, it's just like takes him a little while. He's going around. It's kind of, you could look at it and you could be like, okay, like it loses its meaning because there's so many people, but it doesn't, because for one moment, whether he pays attention to every single player in training or talks to every single staff member, for one moment, he's made a connection with those people for the day. And that struck me as a really important piece of culture. And it doesn't have to be that gesture, but I have recognized that to be an important thing, especially in sports where it inherently gets competitive and a little weird at some point during the day when you're holding high standards and stuff in any high performance environment. But I think that was an important one. And I'd say that, I keep going back to UNC because that's what I think of, but also in professional teams I'm on, I think every team develops its own little rituals in different ways and its own identity in little ways. And it might be just a way that people arrive and warm up. It might be, when I played in Sweden, the team had a little ritual of going to this particular coffee shop that was near the stadium on the way to the game. And it provides some comfort and something predictable within a very unpredictable environment.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about high performing cultures are really unpredictable, because that's the whole thing. You're putting yourself out there and you're embracing discomfort. But with that, you need to rebalance with the comforting factors. And I think the rituals are a really big and important part of that.
It's an interesting perspective. And before you said that, I don't think I actually have thought of rituals in that context, that the ability of a ritual to create something very predictable, which gives a sense of comfort in a high performance, unpredictable kind of way or environment. In the running world, your dad may have talked before. I don't know if he's told you about, there's a famous coach in Illinois called Joe Newton. And there was a book called The Long Green Line. It was a team in Illinois that had won, for 50 years, literally. They were one of the best teams in the country. And it was this coach and had this great team. And I remember watching a video of that team once, and they would have 100 people on a cross country team. And one of the many rituals that Joe Newton, the coach, had, similar to what you were describing with your coach at Gotham, is every single day at every single practice when they finished, he looked at every runner in the eye and shook their hand, much as you're describing this moment of connection that even if you're the 100th guy on the team, you're important. I'm thinking about you. You're real right now. And I think those kinds of predictable things, whether it's that connection or even just something as predictable as, what you're describing in Sweden, it gives some level of comfort to know something is unchanging here. And I think, as I think about that, and I think about my whole career, I've often said that I think one of the things that great leaders do, whether it's a head coach or a leader of a company, is they do create a somewhat predictable environment. I've often said they make decisions within a philosophical framework. There's a way that we think about things here. And you can rely, if you're a player on my team or you're an employee in my company, that here's how I'm going to approach this. And there's a predictability about that allows you to not worry about that and go focus on stuff you got to focus on, because you're not worried about, is the president or is the coach going to fly off his handle because he's pissed off about something right now and you don't know where he's going to be. If he's predictable, he or she is predictable, and you know what you can expect, it allows you to focus on your stuff and not worry about the rest. And I think that's part of what the rituals do too.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because that's what I think is valuable in the cultures that are outlined. When you have your core values written out, the cultures that are successful, I think, is where the leader and the leaders on the team or within the group or within the company act in accordance with those. And it's comforting to people. Yes. When the actions don't seem to line up, or they're erratic, or sometimes they do, and who knows what's going to happen the next day, that's very disconcerting. And it actually, I think, can backfire on even writing them down in the first place. It's better maybe sometimes not to. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of does fit together with why I think, this is our puzzle at Gotham right now. It's, yes, we need to document something that's clear where we say, this is how we operate, here's how decisions are being made. But we have to make sure that that is operationalized into everything we do. And that's a really difficult project, especially when your team is already very good and has high expectations. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. I've been part of it being done well, but how do you create that? Where do you start? How do you make sure it's being done? And it's really hard.
Yeah. And I think, your point about authenticity is incredibly important. And I see this in the corporate world, and everybody in the corporate world has experienced those companies like you're describing in some teams that have created their sets of core values, vision statements, mission statements, all that kind of stuff, that 95% of the time are a bunch of BS and don't really mean anything. And I would agree with you. To a certain extent, it's worse to have something that you say and don't live to than to not have it. It would be better just to not have it. But if we're really authentic about it, it's an incredibly powerful thing. Folks, that brings us to the end of the first part of my conversation with Yael Averbuch, former professional athlete, owner of the training app Techne Futbol, and general manager for New Jersey, New York, Gotham FC. In part 2 of our episode of Culture Architects, we're going to get a lot more into Yael's experience of well-built team cultures, the evolution of her view of team dynamics, and a lot more about the challenges of being a young team like Gotham FC. Make sure you stay tuned.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.